All right, well, thank you and welcome to everybody who is out listening to our webinar today. My name is Abby Bauer and I'm an associate editor for Forage Dairyman magazine. I'd like to thank you for joining us today on this Veterans Day. And first and foremost, I'd like to extend all of our appreciation and a great big thank you to all who are currently serving and who have served our country here in America to help us have all the freedoms that we do have. So again, thank you to all who have served in the past and currently who are serving us today. Today, we have a presentation titled A Feed and Forage Outlook. And we know it's been a challenging harvest year, especially in the Midwest and parts of the East. Just so much rain and snow and cold weather, and that's really impacting the harvest and then the feed inventory and what people will have to work with through the winter and next spring. So we definitely want to talk about this today and hopefully offer some pointers on how to handle this tough situation that's out there. We have a duo of speakers today that we're lucky enough to listen to, both Mike Hutjens from the University of Illinois and Mike Rankin, who is our Hay and Forage Grower magazine managing editor. Mike Hutjens, he is also our co-host for the webinar, if you've listened in before. So he is a familiar voice to us, all of us here in the webinar series. Mike was originally from Wisconsin, and he graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison before working for the University of Minnesota Extension. Then he headed slightly south to Illinois, where he's been working at the university since 1979. Even though he is officially or technically retired, he still travels extensively, talking to audiences all over the world about dairy cattle nutrition. So very, very pleased to have him on board to talk with us today. Our other speaker who will actually speak first is Mike Rankin. And as I mentioned, he's the managing editor of Hay and Forage Grower magazine, which is based out of our office here in Fort Atkinson, the same office where we produce the Forage Dairyman. Mike earned his master's degree from Iowa State University, and then after spending some time working on a dairy farm, he joined the University of Wisconsin Extension as a crops and soil agent in Fond du Lac County, which is in northeast Wisconsin. After serving the agricultural community there for 27 years, he joined our team to become the manager of Hay and Forage Grower magazine. Other members of our team that help keep everything running smoothly are Jim Baltz, who works at the University of Illinois as our webinar producer, and then our Forage Dairyman online media manager, Patty Hurchin, who does a lot of work behind the scenes as well. Another important group to recognize today is our sponsor for this webinar, and that is Kuhn, an agricultural machinery manufacturer in North America. Very pleased to have their support of this program today. Wanted to point out that if you're listening live, you have access to a PDF sheet of the slides that can be printed. If you go to the GoToWebinar control panel, near the bottom, there's a handout section. And if you click on there, there's two options for printing out the slides. So if you want to follow along and take notes, that's an opportunity for you to do that right there. There's also a question section. So if you have any questions that pop up during the webinar and you want to ask them, feel free to type them in. And at the end of the webinar, we'll go through and answer those questions. So that's something that's available to you as well. I think everything, we should be good to go. We have a good group on board and we have both of our speakers here online with us. So I think I will turn the microphone over to Mike and let him get started with his part of the presentation.
Well, very good. Thanks, Abby, for that great introduction. It's an interesting program. Basically, I'm kind of the warm-up act for Mike Rankin, and then I come in at the end of the late innings and close it out. So I think we have a great program for you. And certainly not a big surprise to any of you online today that this first PowerPoint says it's been a very interesting year, both in terms of forage and feed production. And Mike Rankin will walk through these a little more carefully during his presentation here. But you can see it started already last winter when we had that really cold weather that killed some alfalfa and some wheat also here in the Midwest. And of course, that has some impacts on not only wheat, but also on wheat silage, which is used on many dairy farms as an early forage crop, and then with straw. And you'll more about that in just a minute. Then we had a wet spring, as you'll see here in just a minute, flooded areas. In fact, Mike, there's some people thinking that some of this land is going to be really set back for several years along the Mississippi, Missouri rivers, really got hammered pretty hard. Another factor that we don't have a really good feel on where it's all going to end up as the prevent plant acreages. And that's over 11 million acres as we have, and it may even be higher than that. Government keeps changing the numbers on here. And of course, that was then opened up to be harvested instead of November and September. And so we had people harvesting that. You're going to see a little bit of that in my presentation as well. And then, of course, it's going to be an interesting year for both quality and quantity. And both Mike and myself will talk about that. And of course, it's snowing here in Champaign, which is really, really early here as far as that goes. We still have soybeans in the field. And of course, snow on soybeans is not a good deal as far as trying to combine them. And of course, we've had killing frost some areas for several weeks. So what a wild year compared to last year out there as well. Thought you might find this interesting. Jim Baltz actually did the finding here. This is May 1, 2019. And just focus on Illinois if you wish. If a lot of us folks in Wisconsin, the Midwest, can see we got some really wet above normal moisture departures there. That is May 1st, 2019. Now remember this, watch Illinois, because here comes September 1st, and lo and behold, you can see that we were actually had some drought areas in central and southern Illinois, and our farmers tell us it did affect yield, filling of the corn specifically as far as that goes. And we all were aware they were hoping that big hurricane that was going to come in, was going to really hit the southern and southeastern part of the United States, because they really needed some moisture as well. So I know most of the material covered today will be on forages, but just a quick look at our other feedstuffs. This is the latest information, and Jim Baltz is really good. He did this on Sunday. We just got the information on Saturday. It looks like right now the USDA, and of course people argue where they're getting their numbers, but 13.6 billion bushels of corn. That's a lot of corn as far as that goes. But here in Illinois, we're going to be down about 30 to 32 bushels yield per acre. And so that's going to be somewhere around 179 bushels per acre compared to last year. The current price, about $3.86 a bushel, is what's on the futures as far as that goes. And certainly we will have some lower ending stocks, but it's not low enough to trigger some higher feed prices. And of course, dairymen who are buying feed and livestock people buying corn, they ask us, well, when should they pull the trigger? And I wish I knew that answer. Less ethanol, because there's some politics involved there. And even though we have lots of livestock here in the United States, less use for livestock feeding as well. So that's kind of the wild card on corn grain. Soybeans, again, very similar type story. 3.5 billion bushels there, down about 1 million bushel. Again, again, not as much down as we thought it might be. In fact, some of our farmers are quite surprised. We're going to be down about 12 or 13 bushels to the acre. We're going to average around in the low 50s on soybeans this year. Current price on January futures, $9.34. Of course, there's politics involved there as well. The outlook, according to one of the economists, said reduced crush soybeans this year in the U.S., higher ending stocks, which keeps the lid on those prices, and a big question mark behind exports and a call. We all know that's kind of China, and if we are going to sign a deal with them as well. So we then looked at some of the break-even prices for some of the other feedstuffs that our dairy farmers here in the Midwest will look at. So those of you out west, almond hulls, and those of you in Florida will have some of the orange byproduct feeds down there as well. But you can see corn still is, if you look at sesame, and we use the we adjust for amino acids as well on this one here, just came in, and you can see they're in the green. So if you're in the green, those are good buys. So shell corn is good buy. By the way, if some of you are struggling with that, that's $4.06 a bushel of the current price plugged in. The break even $4.66 a bushel. So you can see a pretty nice spread there as well. Soybean meal, low quality alfalfa is pretty much a push at this point. Corn silage continues to look really a good buy. Mike will let you discuss more about this quality of alfalfa and prices. The number we had was 230 that came in here on Friday. And of course, corn stalks and straw are a good buy, but I'm not sure many of us are going to just feed that to our dairy cows this year. The next table also shows some other very popular Midwest byproduct feeds out there, and they're all in the green except for soy hulls. Soy hulls are a bit overpriced here. Hominy looks good as well. I didn't have room to put it on my point, but you can look at that at your leisure. But you can see some of these byproduct feeds are really fairly attractive and may come back a bit later when we talk about strategies and alternatives as well. So that kind of warms up the group here, Mike, and we'll turn it over to you to let you tell us a little more about what happened with our forages in 2019.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We'll take a quick run through kind of where we're sitting from a hay and forage perspective as we sit here in the middle of November. Mike already showed you a slide earlier on the kind of precipitation we had this spring. So this map to the on your left is one that is always interesting to look at. This is April through June precipitation, and each state has a number in it. They've been looking at weather data 125 years now. So if you look at that map, you can see almost everything is above average and some much above average. So we'll take Mike's state of Illinois there, and it has 121. That means that of the 125 years they've been doing this, this was the 121st wettest, or I guess we could say the 5th wettest, 4 years that were actually wetter. But I think what is striking about this map is just how widespread this precipitation fell. And it really had an impact on harvesting forages this spring. You see that picture on the right there, where the field is just absolutely rutted up. And, you're not going to, get that back anytime for the remainder of that stand life, if in fact it goes beyond this year. Okay, let's, again, another striking map. There won't be too many summers when you pull up the July 9th drought monitor and see a white United States. There was just virtually no drought anywhere in the U.S. Yeah, there's a few small areas, but nothing like you would normally see in a typical year when July 9th rolls around. Let's take a look at May 1 hay stocks. USDA tracks hay stocks on May 1st and December 1st. And what you'll notice out here in 2019 is that one of the lowest hay stock years we've had since the turn of the century. Only I think 2013 that kind of followed a couple of drought years is lower. And so we really started the growing season with not a lot of dry hay in barns and stacks across the United States. One thing that I did this year earlier when these May 1st stocks came out was I looked at U.S. hay disappearance, and this would be the amount of hay that we feed from December 1st to May 1st. And so basically the difference in December 1st stocks and May 1st stocks. And it was striking to me that starting in 2012, how much less that amount actually is and has continued to be since that time. I mean, we're talking a fairly major shift in terms of how much hay disappearance we have as a result of that 2011, 2012 drought years. And I'll point something else out about those years as well. But right now, we no longer make as much feed as we once did in terms of hay. And of course, that affects supply. And I'm trying to explain why this has occurred these past several years. Since 2012, we've been below 70 million tons, or right at it. And we can't really blame this on lower numbers of livestock, because both the dairy and the beef herds are pretty much back to where they were pre 2012. And if we look at production from 2000 to 2010, we usually averaged right around 150 million tons here in the U.S. And since that time, that average has dropped to about 130 million tons. So I guess the bottom line here is that we just don't make as much hay. There isn't as much out there. And we don't feed as much either. So that's kind of a major trend shift. If we look at alfalfa hay prices, and this is, I just picked August, and you can see that 2019, and we'll look at this in more detail in just a second, pretty similar to 2018 in terms of where we were. September numbers just came out, and that average price bumped up to 181, and it's not uncommon to see it bump up as we get into late fall and through winter. But we're running pretty close right now anyway to what we did last year. If we break this out just a little bit more, you can see we're not nearly as high as we were back in 2014. If we're looking at prices right now, California premium supreme quality hay is running about 260 to 290 delivered. Here in the Midwest, probably 220 to 280 delivered. So here is the monthly hay price, and this is for all qualities. So it's an average of all qualities, not just supreme or premium, which we'll look at here in a second. But what you can see is we started this year, and hay prices were significantly higher than they were in 2018 at the same time. And as we've moved through the year, the prices have kind of come together. In other words, what's happened is that in 2018, we saw a fairly large increase in the hay price from January to the middle of the year. And now what we're finding this year is that we peaked out in May at $204 a ton, which was, I should say, one of the highest averages we've had, I think, since 2014. And then we've come down. The September number just came out for 2019. That's at 181. So it's starting to creep back up again. But my point here would be that I think hay prices this year and going through this winter may be pretty similar to what we had last year, if not a little bit higher. The real thing that you have to watch is the quality. And if we break out into the supreme and premium quality hay grades, this is something new that USDA is doing and just started this year. And there's a lot of numbers here. I mostly want to focus on this column to the far right, our most recent September numbers, and the numbers across the bottom, which is a 5-state average. But USDA started looking at these numbers to help in their determination of the feed costs for the dairy margin coverage program, the new Farm Bill program for dairy producers. And of course, by doing it this way, it raises that feed cost compared to how they used to do it, where they would just take all qualities. And so it's an advantage actually in that program in terms of dairy producers because it puts the hay price higher. But they determine these prices for the top dairy states in the country, and then they take the top 5 and average that number, and that's those numbers you see along there at the bottom. Now, this is the first year, so we can't compare it to past years, but you can see right now it sits at about $204 a ton. And you know, there's some things that occur when they do this. For example, if we take a look at New York. Now, why does New York drop from 246 in August to 200 in September? I have no explanation for that, but it clearly affects that bottom line average there, which went down actually $4 from August. But these are now the numbers that are being used in that dairy margin coverage program, and they're kind of interesting to follow as we go through the year. And next year when we do this, we'll be able to compare these to the past year. Well, let's take a look at the big picture here, forage-wise. Here's what we're talking about. We've pretty much beat the excessive rainfall horse to death already, but it did have a huge impact on both hay crop and corn silages this year. The winter kill and winter injury thing with alfalfa was kind of interesting. I talked to a lot of producers from all over the country, actually. Obviously, Midwest is where we have most of the injury and Northeast. But it was really spotty. You would talk to one person who said, I lost 80% of my alfalfa this spring. And another person who wouldn't be too far away said, all of mine came through looking really good. So it was really a hit and miss kind of a deal. Obviously, a lot of times it's related to ice and drainage and those kinds of issues, but it was above average. As we look at USDA forecasts for this year, they're saying that alfalfa and alfalfa grass acres be up 1.3% compared to last year. And last year they were way up by about 3 times that much. And they're also predicting higher yields. So even though we had all this lousy weather, at least from a preliminary standpoint, USDA is saying there's going to be a little more production out there. We'll wait and see. The final numbers don't come out till after the first of the year. So total U.S. production about 3% higher. California is interesting. They are now at their alfalfa production is at its lowest point since 1936. Now, let's keep that in relative terms. They're still a big alfalfa producing state, but they used to be #1, and now they just break the top 5. And that's because almond trees right now, nut trees, are making a lot more money for landowners than alfalfa is. We have an improved dairy outlook. Finally, here in 2019, we'll see how that shakes out. And still a lot of trade issues impacting both dairy and hay. Won't spend a lot of time on this, but it does affect dairy producers. As we look through August, alfalfa hay exports were up over 2018 by 1%, which is kind of surprising, actually. And tariffs had a significant impact on China, both with dairy products and alfalfa hay. As we look at that, oops, I just lost my screen here just a second. As we look at this, I gotta get my screen back. Sorry about that. Those tariffs went in July, and you can see how that impacted exports to China last year, which is that red line. Recently, they've started to come back, and in fact, in September, China was almost at 100,000 metric tons. They've temporarily taken those tariffs off. But what I wanted to mention is that in the market facilitation program, USDA is providing payments to alfalfa growers regardless of crop utilization. So whether you sell hay or export hay or not, if you even just feed it, you're eligible for a payment on your alfalfa acres. I'm not sure what that payment's going to be. Probably not as much as soybean farmers are going to get. But if you haven't thought about that, it might be something you would like to think about. I think the deadline is sometime in December. What we're hearing, first cutting forage quality down somewhat, but in a lot of cases, not down as much as we might think, given the horrendous conditions. And as we try to explain that, I think one of the things we might be able to get out of that is that when you have cool spring temperatures like we had, that does kind of temper the quality decline for those delays. Hay inventories look to be sufficient across the board. A lot of forage harvested from these prevent plant acres, including a lot of late planted corn for silage. And the quality on that stuff is going to be all over the place. So make sure you get a forage test. A lot of sorghum planted this year. And people I talked to who planted it at least here in the Midwest, mixed results. If you were in an area where it stayed cool and wet, sorghum being a warm season species, actually doesn't do all that well. So again, it was a savior in some places, a disappointment in others. Talking to seed people, seed inventories for next year really look good for most species. As is always the case, your top hybrids and varieties are going to be in the shortest supplies. We talked about the wet spring. Well, this fall harvest, as Mike will allude to later as well, is was a nightmare for a lot of people. A lot of corn got too dry because the fields were too wet. Some of it frosted before it was actually mature and then maybe harvested a little wet. Soil compaction issues are going to be huge for next year and years to come. Diseases, mycotoxins, when corn sits out there in the field under cool temperatures, oftentimes are an issue. So that's going to be something to be aware of as well. I think nutritionists are going to earn their keep this winter. How much lower quality hay and silage inventories will temper milk production is probably remains to be seen, and it will vary a lot from farm to farm depending on what's actually in inventory. I think this year and going through this winter and into next year, forage test frequently, because there is a wide range of forage quality out there in bunkers and hay barns. So here's, as of the end of October, here's where hay prices were sitting. From a USDA standpoint, these are all state reports, and we publish these in our electronic newsletter on a weekly basis. But I really don't think hay prices, by and large, are going to be that much different from what we saw last winter. And I think last year compared to 2017 was a bigger difference than what we'll see this year. So with that, Mike, I will conclude and let you carry on.
Well, very good, Mike. You've really done a great job here. I'll come in the seventh inning and hopefully not allow too many errors in the field. I'm going to talk briefly about forage quality and quantity. I want to thank Dairyland Labs, Cumberland Valley, and Rock River for providing some data to us. Here are some data that came from Dairyland Labs. You can take a look, and a bit surprising. Here's their 2019 data. You can see it's based on some corn silage, large numbers here, looking at the crop. And not a lot of things to see here. Notice the protein is up there. That doesn't surprise me much. I thought that usually means starch will be down. But surprisingly, Mike, our starch numbers didn't vary all that much. And you can see, if anything, a slight trend and a little better NDF digestibility. I'm not sure that's real, but Mike's got it right. They're going to be all over the map. Here, so you would like to look at graphics, you can see over here the bell-shaped curves on where these samples shake out. And you can study that at your leisure. I think the point is that on average, average, it doesn't look all that bad. Here comes the alfalfa crop. You can see 30,000 samples here. And again, not a lot of big changes. I mirror some of the comments that Mike said a bit earlier. If anything, you can see a nice increase here. If that's happening on your farm, hooray for you. A nice increase here in NDF digestibility of organic matter at the 30-hour time. And that's where a lot of us use that number. And typically a very average number, typically 45, 46 will catch a lot of samples. So we're right on there as well. So again, not a lot of surprises there, but certainly I don't, you all know what average means in terms of drowning in a lake that averages 3 feet deep. Cumberland Valley also provided us some nice data, a little wider with here. They fall right in line pretty much with the data we shared with you earlier. You can see the corn silage samples here, 13,000 of them. Basically, this year's corn silage, we think. We say think because a number of farmers are carrying big inventory. So a lot of farmers here in Illinois are going to be feeding new crop corn silage probably starting in January, February. I know one very large farm, he's not going to start it probably until almost a year from now as far as that goes as here. So again, you can see these numbers fit pretty much similar. Again, you can see what the stars when this data was collected. Not a big surprise as they fall really much in line with the data from Dairyland Labs here. You can see the grass silages and grass hay really kind of get hammered as far as that goes. Mike, I'm not sure if that just reflects just some differences, but you can see really high NDFs there. So the proteins, the NDFs, and adjustability surprisingly pretty good at this stage of the game over here as well. Mike then said, well, could you go in and could we try to see how that first crop's going to look? So Jim Baltz did all the heavy lifting on this one here, and he went in and we just took and looked at all samples. This is the Cumberland Valley because we have access to their database there. Then we picked out Wisconsin and we picked out New York and said, okay, we're going to look at these specific states, which were on Mike's map, and you can see the timeline we're here, the number of samples there. And again, not a lot of surprises here. We thought we were going to see, the protein being down a couple of clicks. It is down a little bit compared to what we saw a bit earlier. The NDF numbers, very typical. Digestibility, spot on. And of course, the RFQs are a nice. We like the index, Mike. RFQs probably a little on the low side as far as that goes. We expect to see a lot of our forages fed to our dairy cows in that 160, 170 range or even slightly higher. This data comes from Rock River. This looks at the digestibility of the corn silage. And again, no surprises here. You can see this corn silage gets better with age, and that's why we call it Christmas corn silage. We ideally don't want to open up these bags, bunkers, or silos until the Christmas season because that starch becomes more available. And so you can see this rather seasonal type shift that's occurring here as well. So not a lot of excitement here other than the fact that it's going to happen again. And if we have starch and we got a process and it's wet enough and we had a good inoculant, it should again come back up here as the time goes on. Here is looking at NDF numbers, and again, not a lot of changes here as we saw it a bit earlier in the earlier data set. Here come the yeast counts, and you can see the yeast counts are going up. And I think that's always going to be one of our questions, some of this late harvested, less mature corn silage, if we're going to get good fermentations. But I think that's what our VFA analysis will help us a little bit with here a bit later on. We'll talk about that. And you can see it looks like the yeast counts are going up here. And in the blue here, that would be the U.S. Midwest numbers. You can, if your eyes are sharp enough, you can see all the other dots, but the folks at Rock River did a nice job on that. Vomitoxin, I think we're early. I think that's going to be a risk out there. What we're telling our producers is stay in touch with your testing labs and see what's coming in. Sampling on these microtoxins can really be a bummer as far as that goes. We had a phone call 3 days ago, and basically I said, let's just hold off on this because they're going to invest anywhere from $80 to $100 to get what we call the Big Four analysis done, and I would wait to see kind of what we're seeing in the crop. But we are a little nervous that we're going to see with all this wet weather, immature crops, and in some cases, extremely dry corn silage, it was frosted, that we could have some excitement. So eyes wide open on that one as well. So let's do a quick survey here and let you a chance to vote. We only have one question here because we have a pretty full agenda. Abby, do you want to read these to our listeners what the choices are?
I sure can. The question here is, what changes will you consider in 2020? So if feed inventories are a little bit short, what might you do on your operation to make up for that? Options here are buy additional forage, replace forage shortages with byproduct feeds, replace straw with corn stalks or another forage, feed less forage overall and more concentrates, or you won't need to make any changes. You've got enough feed inventory. So I know this will vary depending where you're located in the country and in the world, but just want to see what people are going to be doing out there if there's any adjustments that need to be made. So it looks like we've got a good group in so far with the votes. We'll give you a few more seconds. And then, Jim, I think we can close the poll.
And let's see what we got here. I got to, much like Mike Rankin, I got to slide it over here a little bit so I can see it. An interesting cross-section at this point. All of you are seeing it as well. Not a lot of surprises here. Byproducts is the winner at this point. Maybe bring a more byproduct feeding program. The good news is 27% said no changes are needed. So Mike, it probably reflects business as usual at there. Buying some forages, 27% pick that as well. So again, those are choices out there. And Jim, if you want to close that out, and we will move forward here. So we're going to go into my second part of the talk, and that is a number of farmers here, and for some people, you may just have to kind of listen along here, but we have chopping immature corn silage. You'll see the numbers varying a great deal. We went through about 6 or 7 different research papers and extension publications we could find, and a lot of this basically is now history at this point. Our thought was to let the plant get as mature as you can, try to build as much starch as we can. So we said, until we get the killing frost, which was about a week ago here in central Illinois, we were just going to let that corn crop mature out if we can. The guideline is that it will lose about a half a point per day. Moisture, of course, and that depends a bit on the drying day, wind, temperature, and rain situations as well. Nitrates could be a problem because even though we have frost in these corn plants, the roots are still able to bring up moisture, and as a result, we could see some nitrate challenges. Just something to tuck in the back of your mind. But again, a question comes in if it does ferment or not. Here's some neat data from Wisconsin. It's got a little age on it, but you can pick your poison here and study this at your leisure as our time is rapidly getting away from us. But you can see that if you're going to be in that, and that's kind of the new window now. We'd like to chop around 35, 36, 37% dry matter just to build the starch levels on up. Notice the digestibility doesn't change very much. The in vitro dry matter digestibility way out there on the left side of the on the right side of the PowerPoint there, and you can see some of the changes here, and we're off and running. So next question might be more valuable right now, and that is, what is it really worth? And if you go to the various publications, a nice big range out there, Mike, 65 to 85% of the normal corn silage. And of course, you really want to inoculate it. It's although I understand there are still some people chopping corn silage in Wisconsin or trying to at this point. I think the take-home message, if possible, if you can separate it out, I think it's going to be an unusual silage, and basically it allows you the flexibility of who is going to get that and at what level you want to feed it. So here's what Jim put together very nicely for us. And again, I made some assumptions here. The normal corn silage is going to be at $40 per wet ton. That comes right off of sesame. You can see 35% dry matter. There, I've got 700 pounds of dry matter listed up there as well. And my pointer is missing in action, so there we go. So you can see starch, 30% starch. So I'm going to have 210 pounds of starch in that ton of wet corn silage, or 700 pounds of dry matter. Here's my immature. I'm going to have it 30. Now you got to test it. Just like Mike said, you got to test that. So I use 30, nice round number. You can see where these numbers are coming from. I'm going to assume 20% starch. That might be a gift in some situations there. So what I'm missing here, you can see, is 90 pounds of starch is missing. And so the next question is, well, what is that? What is the value of that is missing in that immature corn silage? I'm using $4 a bushel, a 56-pound bushel weight there, 70% starch if it's good corn. Again, some of this late corn could be what they call light bushel weight, so the starch may be down there. So I have roughly about 40 pounds of starch found in a bushel of corn. Now remember, we're missing 90 pounds of starch in an immature corn silage using my numbers and my assumptions assumptions there. So I divided that by 39 pounds of starch and a bushel of dry corn. And as a result, I need about a bit around about 2.5 bushels of corn, dry corn equivalent added there, $4 a bushel. And that means that I've lost, or I do not have $9 of feed value in the immature corn silage that I have there. So I go back here, and Jim did a nice job of laying it out. You can follow this math very nicely. This is about 6 cents a pound for dry matter, and this is around a nickel. So the question is that a good deal for you out there? And I'd use this same table for both the buyer and the seller as far as that goes. I think another one besides Mike's excellent point that you've got to test the forage, I need to know now, is this cow going to run out of feed in May, or is she going to run out in July? And the question is, we must know where we're at. So here we go. And again, here we go with that magic word assumption again. I got a 1,400-pound cow. I'm going to call her Holstein. Thumb rule is she's going to eat about 2% of her body weight as forages. That number may go down this year because of inventory, or it may go down because of quality, but 2% is a pretty good number. That means she's going to eat about 28 pounds of forage dry matter each day. I use 365 because my dry cow, she eats about that same amount of forage dry matter. So I need to run around 5 tons of dry matter per cow per year. And then it comes in, I'm going to shrink it. I use 6% shrink. That could be much higher than that, depending on how you manage your bunkers and piles as far as that goes. The uprights, that could be perhaps even shaved back a little bit. But now I need about 5.4 tons there. So I've got 5.4 tons of dry matter I need until I get to my next harvest window. Now, that may be small grain that be harvested in April. That could be first cutting in May. That could be corn silage that hopefully we'll harvest next year in August, when we should be doing it as far as that goes. Now, remember, some of you are going to have replacement heifers. The thumb rule there is add about 30% more to this number if you're going to have replacement heifers on feed at the same time. So the question is, if you're short, what are you going to do? And I think, Mike, the question, the comment, the challenge to my listeners, let's make that decision now. Because if we're going to start diluting out and saving some of that less available forage dry matter on my farm due to growing conditions, I've got choices out there that I can plug in now. The real trouble is when it happens in March and now we're running out of corn silage, what am I going to do? I wish I would have known that back in November, because then I can make some adjustments as far as that goes as well. So we do have alternatives up there. You can see them listed at your leisure, and basically, in most cases, even the corn stalks now with the weather we're having can be a challenge. Jim got out and took, this is a picture in good old central Illinois. This is prevent plant soybean baleage out here, about 1.5 tons of per acre of dry matter. You can see that they are making silage out of it here. They're bagging it on up. That shows you where the soybeans are at, and you can see a very good quality feed. This will feed like almost like a high quality alfalfa, a little stemmy, but there it is. We're going to wrap up the last 5 minutes talking about corn stover as a forage extender. So it's sitting out here in many farms here in the United States as far as that goes. If you ask, well, what is the value? What is the quality of it? Well, basically, it's a filler feed. It means I can stretch inventories. It's going to be low in protein. That will match up with some of that really good alfalfa that Mike was talking about a bit earlier. You can see the fibers are quite high at this stage of the game. Lots of lignin in there, which means that probably it's not going to help me a great deal in high producing cows. Here is some data pulled together by a group of researchers, and you can see these beef cattle are not dummies out there. If you watch them out there gleaning this time of the season, they're doing really pretty well, because they're gonna find the various parts of the corn plant. You can see corn cobs is not God's gift to a high quality digestible feed here, and the stalk as well. So they will pick off the good stuff as far as that goes. So what are we going to do with dairy cattle at this point? And we recognize what the quality is going to be. For lactating cows, I could be seeing it as a straw replacement. And there are farmers talking about it, because straw now about $135 a ton if you can find it as far as that goes. So a pound or two of that, or a kilo can be a fairly effective fiber, higher lignin, slower rate of passage. And if that's what you need in your ration, especially with these byproduct feeds and maybe concentrates, think about that. Dry cows, if you're into the Dr. Jim Drakely diet, about a third of that forage dry matter is going to be straw. No research on corn stalks, but I think if you could chop them to make them look like corn silage, we could have some pretty good luck, especially especially if there's no mycotoxins or other quality industry problems there. And older heifers, Pat Huffman has done some nice work up there before he retired, looking at older heifer type diets. Strategy is we've got to get them processed before feeding. I'd like to have that looking like corn silage, to be very honest with you. That could be a challenge with some of our processors as far as that goes. How you pick it up, and if you are going to bale it, if you're going to try to ensile it, you've got to get moisture there to get the job done. On our farm in Wisconsin, we used to use it for bedding and use a flail chopper to get it to dry down and then pick it back up a bit later as far as that goes. So what is that worth? The corn stover itself. So you may be buying this from a neighboring farm. Dave Fisher pulled these data together for me a bit earlier. And basically the fertilizer value, NP and K, somewhere around $30 to $40 a ton. So if it's not your corn stocks, be well aware that he's probably not going to give them away to you free of charge unless you're going to bring manure back as far as that goes. No value for organic matter here. Harvesting costs going to be very typical of that $30 to $40 a ton. So you can see the feed value is the value of that is going to be somewhere around $90 there. The cost of getting in, break-even price actually a little bit higher than that. You saw that when we saw that a bit earlier as far as that goes. The last thing to talk about, and we will go through this very quickly because you've got the PowerPoints if you want that. And you can see that we can take some of these lower quality products such as corn cobs, straws, corn stovers, and treat them with a fairly strong base. And what that does is it breaks down the linkages between the lignin and some of the other fiber fractions to allow the bacteria to have a shot of breaking down some of that cell wall carbohydrate. And this is just a picture showing that these are really harsh chemicals. You'll see a bit later, you got to be very careful with these here, but you can really break up that fiber here by going through, this happens to use a calcium hydroxide type treatment here. If you're going to do that, you're going to have to add some water to that. This is some work primarily done in the beef circles, Iowa State, Nebraska. I've done a little bit here work at Illinois. At this point, we're going to add get up to 50% moisture. That can be a lot of water, as you'll see here in just a minute. The two products they did here, we're looking at calcium oxide or calcium hydroxide. Those are the recommended levels. And of course, the processing and thorough mixing is going to be important. This is kind of a flow chart showing that we're going to take a corn stover here that's going to have 70% dry matter coming in. It's probably going to be every bit of that wet there. So you can see we're going to add about 600 pounds of water to that, add the chemicals to that, and we have to let it ferment. Now, I should say we're ferment, let it work, chemically work. And now it's pretty cold, so I'm not sure how much chemical reaction we're going to get here, much like we have when we're chopping alfalfa in November and putting it in a bag as well. So at least take about a week for this chemical reaction to occur. The warmer, the better as far as that goes at this point. The pH of that is going to be at least 8.0 or higher. In some of these high grain diets, that can be a little bit of a plus at this stage of the game. And be well aware that over long periods of storage, you got to get rid of the oxygen and limit mold growth as far as that goes as well. This is not for the weak of heart. You got to be very careful. This is very caustic. All these chemicals can really be tough. Ammonium hydroxide, potassium hydroxide, calcium products as well. And it takes some heat to get it done. And yes, they did get one bag burning here at Champaign. So it can generate enough heat that if you don't have the right moisture conditions, it will catch fire as far as that goes. So you might ask, what's the feed value here as we wrap up? And this is some work that basically comes from Nebraska. And you can see that we do a nice job with the chemically treated. We increase NDF digestibility very, very good, up to about 68%. So that's a significant change there. Purdue did a study with mid-lactation cows, and you can see they put in, they replaced 12 and 25% of the product. If you look at the orange area in the middle of the slide here, and you can see that we did lose milk. We did lose some milk here, but not as much as maybe we want to, but certainly one thing to think about as well. So, Mike, let's go ahead and end this webinar. We got some questions that came in here that we can answer. I think from my aspect, my part of the talk, it says, and you go back and look at Mike's ending PowerPoint as well. You got to know your forage inventory. What are your strategies? You could look at reducing animal numbers, but of course, we're now looking at here in Illinois, $20 milk. So a lot of farmers are not looking at that right now. But if you develop a strategy, what are you going to do? Are you going to stretch it? And that where that question came up a bit earlier. Are you going to reduce cow numbers? Are you going to buy forages? And I think Mike's data pretty well shows if you're going to buy forages, I'd be buying them right about now. So, Abby, we'll turn the program back to you to start winding it up before we get to the Q&A.
Very good. Thank you, Mike Hutjens and Mike Rankin, for your insight and giving us an update on the current feed situation and some of your predictions and your recommendations looking forward in the year ahead. So thank you very much for that information. I also want to once again thank Kuhn for sponsoring today's webinar. If you will look at the screen, you'll see a couple of our upcoming webinars, and we hope that you'll make plans to join us. On December 9th, we will do our final webinar of 2019. The title of that presentation will be Feeding Cows to Reach Their Peak. The presenter will be Bill Weiss from The Ohio State University, and the sponsor for that webinar will be QLF, Quality Liquid Feeds. Then our first webinar in 2020, it's hard to believe that we're getting to that time already, but we will kick off the year with a dairy situation and outlook by Mark Stevenson, who is with the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that presentation will be sponsored by Zinpro. So please, if you enjoyed this webinar today, we hope that you'll mark your calendar and attend one of our future webinars. Again, here we want to thank Kuhn for being the sponsor for this month's webinar by both Mike Hutjens and Mike Rankin. If you want to visit this webinar again or share it with anybody else, I just want to let you know that all of our webinars are archived on our website. If you go to www.hordes.com, there's a webinar tab, and all of our webinars, since we've been producing them, which we started to do in 2011, are all available online. So a great educational resource right there. Great, Mike, I think there were a few questions that came in, and one is on the screen. If you want to, or if one of you want to tackle that question, why don't we go ahead and do that?
Well, certainly this question came in, and in fact, it came in here again from another resource. So we got a double dip here, Mike. When any wet forage, and this could be corn silage, could be alfalfa, could be grass silage, could be prevent acreage as well. When the weather is really cold, Fahrenheit, will it ferment properly? And if it's frozen at the time of chopping, will it still ferment? Mike, you want to take a swing at that?
Well, I can add a few comments here. First of all, your silage mass is going to stay pretty close to whatever temperature it was harvested at. So you're not going to get the kind of fermentation you normally would. And when that occurs, some of the ramifications would be that you're not going to get a real bump in starch availability. Your nitrate levels will probably stay higher if that's an issue. Inoculants aren't going to work, even though I would still use them. And then where you can really run into some issues is when it starts to get warm next spring. And that's when things will start happening that if you open up that feed and it warms up, that feed will heat pretty quickly. And so it's just not an ideal situation. I would almost think about getting that kind of feed fed out before we get to warmer temperatures next spring. I don't know what you think about that, Mike.
Yes, Mike, I agree with you 100%. In fact, we had a little experience here at Champaign. A couple of years ago, we harvested some alfalfa basically 3 days before the snow was flying, and they wilted it. Of course, you and I both know it doesn't wilt when it's that cold out there, and we bagged it. And the good news is that after 2 weeks, we opened the bag up, and it looks like green chop. And so basically our thought was, let's, after 2 weeks, let's go ahead and feed it up and get rid of it. The following year, it worked so well, they decided they'd do it again, but now they decided to wait for a couple of months, opened up the bag, and just what Mike said, it went south very, very quickly as far as that goes. So I think the big question I have, and that is, what was the moisture what we chopped it with? First of all, for just to get it compacted, we're hearing people chopping corn silage as wet as 25% dry matter and over 45 to 50. They're still chopping out there. That could be some pretty dry stuff. If you're still going to chop out there, just chop the daylights out of it. I would really I would really chop it pretty short. We're talking like maybe, a quarter-inch theoretical length of chop there, and have those processors tight as you can, because I think, Mike, you're right. That starch is not going to change. And those nice graphs I showed you from Rock River, I'm a little nervous if that's going to happen as well. So I don't think we're not making wine anymore or cheese here. I would, if you're caught with these feeds, I would feed them up, because I think they're going to look pretty much like how they went in at this point. Okay, let's go to another question we have up here. It says, what's the implication of mycotoxins in silage? I think there's a real risk there. And I'm not sure we even know how big a risk it is right now, because a lot of those silages are still not being fed. What can you do to prevent it? Wow, I tell you, gee willikers, it's there. If it's there, there's not much you can do it. As a nutritionist, you can look at some type of a binder that can go in there as far as that goes, and decide if we can bind it on up. So keep a close eye with your feed company and your nutritionists and your testing labs to see what do they see coming in as far as that goes. And that yeast thing could get to be pretty wild as well, because again, as Mike said, once we open up some of those storage units, boy, those wild yeast can just go nuts there and start breaking down some of the lactic acid, and then we can get some more mycotoxin growth occurring there as well. So that's where we're at. Mike, maybe you can answer this one. What do you mean by one of the PowerPoints? It might have even been mine. It says 750 degree days, immature corn silage slide. And I think that was from Silking. Want to make a comment on that?
So the question relates to
this immature corn silage. It might have been on one of my PowerPoints, and it said from the time of silking, it takes about 750 degree days to reach corn silage maturity. And they're asking, okay, what's 750 degree days? What is that term?
Okay. Yeah. So growing degree days is just a metric that is used to kind of account for temperature rather than just counting the raw number of days. So there are many different bases for corn. It's usually base 50, and you take the high temperature and the low temperature, get an average and divide it by 50, and so it's just a metric of taking into account temperature to get in development. It could be for an insect, it could be for a plant, it could be any number of things.
Very good. Another question came in, and that is, what about the corn silage chemical analysis for volatile fatty acids, pH, and so on? Is that good for consumption or not? And basically, I think it's going to be a good benchmark to see if in fact the crop did ferment. You're hoping to see lactic acids over 5%. The ratio of lactic to acetic acid should be about 2 to 1, or about 70% of those acids being produced during the fermentation process. Good corn silage will be below 4. I wish you well on some of this really immature corn silage. The really wet stuff and the really dry stuff is going to be challenged as far as that goes. And I think if you start seeing these unusual fatty acids, especially acetic acid, we've had some experience with acetic acid, and those farmers in which acetic acid is higher than lactic acid have had some real challenges of getting production and consumption utilization of that crop by the animals. There's not much we can do about it, but I think it's going to be a nice bookmark that allows us to know what kind of challenges we have. There's not much I can do about it. I mean, it is what it is. And so if your pH comes back at 5, and you got high levels or very low levels of total VFAs, and acetic acid levels are high, oh boy, here we go at this stage of the game. Another question came in, and that is, what about that field you saw that was kind of tore up there? What should farmers do with that field that's been tore up? And then maybe a side comment also would be, what about those flooded fields that went underwater and stood underwater for weeks of time? Any comments on that from the agronomic aspect, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, that particular field is probably too far gone, so it's going to get ripped up, put into corn. If you're going to do the real deep tillage, typically we recommend not to go any deeper than what you have to. And if you're in a no-till situation, of course, you're not going to be doing that anyway. and it just takes time for that soil to heal a little bit. So there really are no magic bullets. Flooded fields, same way. I think some of the research shows that, these flooded fields, the soil microflora are impacted, and it's just going to take some time to heal those soils. My experience is that we do see yield impacts for several years, a lot of times in those kinds of situations. I would be, especially the flooded fields, what you really need to watch is, what kind of crap, floated in and onto those fields. And, hardware disease becomes an issue in the forage side, especially on alfalfa fields. So that's that kind of thing you got to watch. But there's just no magic bullet there other than time.
We had another question that followed up my discussion on a previous question, and that is NIR analysis okay for VFA numbers? I'm very comfortable with them. Usually the NIR analysis, these NIRs are going to see organics, and they should be able to see these very well. So, Mike, any comments of what chemistry, which would be much more expensive doing these VFAs compared to using NIR analysis, which are almost given to the farmer free of charge when they do the package?
Yeah, I kind of think it depends on the situation and just how concerning the situation actually is, whether you want to go to the additional expense of the wet chemistry or not.
Our final question that we have here, and I don't see any more, and that is there some good economical ways to break down lignocellulose bonds in silage? And we already had the brief discussion about the using the base products, and of course, those are that's a chemical reaction. Rick Grant has also got some neat work that says if you've got some low quality alfalfas, grass hays this year, chop them shorter. So that's a physical breakdown of those of those bonds as well. Dr. Shaver's work will say the fermentation doesn't do much in terms of making the fiber fractions more digestible. It does on the starch side of the equation. We discussed that a bit earlier, but doesn't do much there. So it looks like you're either going to go chemically, go after it, and that has some risks associated with it, and some costs, and some timing. And then, of course, if you've got some of this lower quality grass and like corn stalks, that's why we're gonna grind them pretty short. Not only to try to get them a little bit more digestible, but also to avoid the sorting problem that can occur. And I think, Abby, I think we've got everything caught up at this stage of the game. We'll turn the program back to you.
Great, thank you. We appreciate all the questions that came in, and Mike did a great job answering them. So thank you for that. Once again, I'll point to our future webinars that are upcoming. December 9th, we'll be talking about feeding fresh cows to help them reach their peak lactation. Bill Weiss from The Ohio State University will be our presenter. And then kicking off the year 2020 on January 13th, we will have a dairy situation and outlook presentation by Mark Stevenson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So please make plans to join us for those. Once again, we would like to thank Kuhn for sponsoring our November webinar here today. And also I would like to give an extra thank you to Mike Hutjens and Mike Rankin for their useful presentation and all that insight that they shared with our listeners out there. And most importantly, we want to thank you for taking the time to be with us. It's really our goal to provide information that's useful for you, whether you are on a dairy farm yourself or you're working with clients. And we are grateful that you take the time to join us for these monthly webinars. So until next time, I'd like to say goodbye from all of us here at Hoard's Dairyman and the University of Illinois. Please take care.